Now we're moving into chapter 17, and of course we're doing the first section of 17 on 17.1, and we're dealing with growth and productivity, looking especially at the long run. So first of all, let's think about economic growth and take a look at something from the economic report of the president way back in 1992, where the report says that economic growth is the fundamental determinant of the long-run success of any nation, the basis and source of rising living standards, and the key to meeting the needs of the American people. Well, obviously an economist wrote this. We believe that economic growth, long run especially, long run economic growth, is definitely the source of rising standards of living. If that's important to you, then of course you'll agree with the statement. So let's go ahead and dive into it and figure out why is economic growth the basis of living standards. So let's take a look at what this chapter is going to be all about, not just the 17.1 section, but the entire chapter 17. We're going to be looking at how important economic growth is, how does an economy grow, and is the continued economic growth both possible and is it desirable? So given that as an important kind of thing to be thinking about, let's dive into it. So first of all, before we get into long-run growth, which is the most important, we need to contrast it with short-run growth, because there is a slight difference between the two. So in the short run, we're talking about the production possibilities curve that we had discussed way back at the beginning of our semester. The production possibilities curve stays in one place. And what you're doing is you're moving from an underperforming part or inside the production possibilities curve at what we call an inefficient place, and we're moving toward the production possibilities curve. And so here we are, we're trying to, for instance, we have a lot of unemployment in the economy because there's not enough aggregate demand. And so therefore, the economy needs to be stimulated to move it to its currently existing possible production possibilities frontier. And that's what we would mean by short run growth. But obviously that can't be the answer long run. You can't just keep stimulating the economy with the same level of technology. You will finally, once you reach the production possibilities curve and you keep stimulating the economy, all you get is inflation. And of course, we've talked about that a pretty good bit in previous lectures. So what we're talking about then is the long run change in economic growth or shifting the capacity of the economy to grow. So in other words, we're going to push the production possibilities frontier or curve outward. So if we're going to do that, we need to think about how are we going to shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. That's pretty much the same thing. Shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve is the same thing as pushing out the production possibilities frontier. So the natural rate of unemployment shifts to a higher rate of output. Remember that concept of natural rate of unemployment, that the economy tends to stabilize at a certain level of unemployment beyond which you really can't push the economy. So let's assume that number is somewhere around 4 and 4.5% for the U.S. economy. So roughly 4.5% unemployment. Once we reach that level of output, we really can't expect to stimulate the economy further by lowering the unemployment rate to 2%. I mean, we realize frictional unemployment and structural unemployment are always going to be around. You can't just instantly get people jobs. So you can't simply suppress the unemployment rate lower and lower and lower to get more and more economic growth. What we're talking about is, let's assume that the unemployment rate stays at 4%, because that's the natural rate. We want the economy to grow even when the unemployment rate stays at 4%. So obviously, we're no longer talking about stimulating the economy from a point of inefficiency up to 4% unemployment. We're now talking about even at 4% unemployment, how do we get the economy to continue growing? So let's take a look here at these two graphs where we can actually see the difference theoretically between the two types of growth. So short run growth, you notice we're at a point inside the production possibilities curve at point A, and we move toward point B, which is on the production possibilities frontier. So again, that would be an example of, say, having 8% unemployment in an economy that has too little demand, and we stimulate the economy to move from point A out to point B. But of course, we can't move beyond point B. That's just not possible. Now let's take a look at the right-hand graph. This is the long-run one. We're taking a look at the dashed production possibilities frontier, which was identified in the previous slide, and we're pushing the entire curve farther out so that we can be on a point like C, which is on a new production possibilities frontier farther out. So what can we do to actually shift the productive capacity of the economy? That's what we're trying to figure out. And in this graph, we just have a different picture of it. You notice the long-run aggregate supply curve, the first one, was determined at the natural rate of unemployment. And now we have a new long-run aggregate supply curve farther to the right, and it's also at the same level of unemployment. Now the output is increased because we have a more productive economy. But at this one, we had 4.5% unemployment, which was the natural rate. We're at a fully employed economy. Everything's working, the engine, quote unquote, is working on all cylinders. And at this level of output, we have now somehow shifted the economy's ability to produce, even though we're still at the natural rate of unemployment. So before we move on and start actually talking about how we're going to do this, I want to put a quick little formula in your head because it's a really, really useful formula for thinking about economic growth. So we are going to measure growth, and we're going to use something called the rule of 72. The rule of 72 is a doubling rule. It's a really interesting mathematical trick that if you take the number 72 and divide it by a percentage growth rate, it will tell you how many years it will take for that economy to double in size from its original size. So for instance, let's assume that the economy is growing at 3.5%. So if you use the rule of 72, as you see in our little formula, you would take the number 72, divide it by 3.5, and that gives you, in this case, 20 years. So if your economy could grow at even a relatively low rate of 3.5% a year, but you were able to do that for year after year after year for 20 years, the entire size of your economy would double. So if your original GDP was at $10 trillion, in 20 years it would now be at $20 trillion. And that's inflation adjusted. We're talking about real GDP would double during that 20-year time period. Now, of course, as you could recognize very quickly, if you could grow at 7%, for instance, 72 divided by 7 is just a tiny bit over 10 years, you could literally double an economy in 10 years at 7%. But if your economy was only growing at 1%, then it might take 72 years for the economy to double. So having a fast growth rate is a very, very valuable thing because the economy's ability to produce both goods and services and the income that goes with that production would be doubling that much more quickly.